All right, so we're back and ready to dive into another fascinating topic. And this time, it's a little bit special because we're getting up close and personal with history right in our own backyard, so to speak.
That's right. We're talking about southeastern Arkansas and northeast Louisiana long before European contact.
Exactly. For our listeners at Ashley County, now, this is your history, right?
Absolutely.
And you sent us some really amazing sources to dig into, so let's talk about those a bit before we get into the nitty-gritty. We have this incredibly detailed site table. It's like a roadmap of archaeological sites. Ashley, Drew, Union, Bradley, Chico counties, all represented.
It even singles out the Shepherd site right there in Ashley
Oh,
County.
yeah. So we'll definitely circle back to that for sure.
Mm.
But it's not just a list of places, right?
Right.
Layered on top of that, we have all this expert analysis helping us understand when people were living at these sites.
And it generally puts them in that time frame of the late Woodland period, about 600 to 1000 CE.
Hey.
Then into the Mississippian period, spanning roughly 1000 to 1600 CE.
So we're talking about that crucial period just before Europeans show up on the scene.
Precisely.
To help us visualize what life was like back then, we also have a fantastic regional cultural context write-up. It really paints a picture of southeast Arkansas during that transition from the late Woodland to the Mississippian.
And to make sure we're getting the full Mississippian picture, we have some great info on that period more broadly, comparing it to the Macon Plateau culture in central Georgia.
Really fascinating stuff. So what we're going to try to do today is bring all of this together to get a glimpse of what it was like to live in southeastern Arkansas during this captivating pre-contact period.
Exactly. We're going to connect this ancient history to the land you know so well.
I love it. Okay, so first things first, let's get a sense of the landscape. What was southeastern Arkansas like back then?
Well, picture this. Vast stretches of forest, a lot different than some of the agricultural landscapes we see today.
Okay, I can see it.
Intricate networks of floodplains, crisscrossing the region. And of course, the rivers. We can't forget about those. The Wachita, the Saline, and of course, the mighty Mississippi River. These rivers weren't just these separate things. They were all interconnected, deeply influencing how people lived, how they traveled, how they interacted.
Right, it's all about those connections. And speaking of connections, let's talk about that transition from the Woodland to the Mississippian period. Now, this wasn't an overnight change, was it?
No, not at all. It was a gradual evolution, and the way it played out could vary quite a bit depending on where you were in the region.
Got it.
So let's take it back a bit. During the earlier Woodland period, you'd see more spread out settlements.
Okay.
People were into smaller scale gardening, growing things like squash and various native seed plants, and they were building those characteristic conical mounds.
Those are the ones that are, cone shaped, right?
Precisely. Conical mounds.
Got it.
Life was very tied to the changing seasons, with hunting and gathering being a major focus.
Makes sense.
Then, as Mississippian influence starts to make its way into the region, we see some new things popping up.
Okay, what kinds of things?
Well, for starters, platform mounds become a lot more common.
And these are like these flat-topped earthen pyramids.
Exactly. They were used as bases for important buildings.
Okay.
In villages, they become more concentrated, often built around a central plaza, almost like a town square.
So more organized?
Right. And they're farming a lot more corn, intensive maize agriculture, and this suggests that they can support larger populations now.
So things are getting a bit more complex, right?
Exactly. And we start to see the beginnings of what we often call chiefdoms.
Chiefdoms. Now, for anyone who might not be super familiar with that term, what are we talking about when we say chiefdom?
Good question. It essentially means a society where you have this hierarchical social organization.
Okay.
You've got a paramount chief who holds a lot of authority over a number of communities, both political and often religious.
So not just like a village leader, but someone with influence over a much wider area.
Exactly. And this power, it's reflected in their ability to organize labor for big projects, like building those mounds.
Okay, so real power. And you mentioned earlier that southeastern Arkansas didn't necessarily follow the same exact Mississippian playbook.
That's right. This area was a bit on the outskirts of those major Mississippian mound centers. So what we often see is this really interesting blending of traditions.
Oh, that's fascinating. So what kinds of things are we talking about here?
Well, imagine this. People might have adopted the more centralized village layouts that are so typical of the Mississippian period. But when it came to burial customs, they stuck with traditions that had roots in the earlier Woodland period.
So they're picking and choosing which aspects to embrace.
Yeah.
Creating their own unique blend.
Exactly. Hybrid traditions, we call them. So you might see people living in a more centralized village, very Mississippian, but still practicing those woodland-style family-focused burial rituals in smaller, less elaborate sites.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. It's about adaptation and keeping what's important to them.
Absolutely. And those rivers we talked about earlier, those were vital in all of this.
Oh, yeah, those were the superhighways of their time, right?
Absolutely. Dugout canoes were the primary way to get around, facilitating not only the movement of people, but also the exchange of goods and ideas up and down the rivers. And, we find things like shell beads from faraway places, exotic stones, materials that weren't local, and even ceremonial objects at these different mound sites across Arkansas and Louisiana. It tells us that the people living in what's now Ashley County, they weren't isolated. They were connected to these wider networks of exchange and interaction.
So let's zoom in a little bit. If we could travel back in time and walk among these people,
Mhm.
what might daily life have looked like for the average person living in these bottomlands?
Well, the picture that emerges is one of a life deeply connected to the natural world. Think about their dwellings, for example. Typically, they were structures built with poles and then covered with woven mats or thatch,
Yeah.
often either circular or rectangular in shape. And being practical people, they would choose slightly elevated areas to build on, like natural ridges.
Makes sense. Gotta stay above those floodwaters.
Exactly. Avoid those seasonal floods that were a fact of life in the region.
Right, smart thinking. And agriculture was obviously becoming a big part of life, too.
Absolutely. And they were cultivating an impressive variety of crops. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, of course,
Classics.
but also things like sumpweed, sunflowers, even maygrass, which is a native grass with edible seeds. They really knew how to make use of what the land provided.
That's really interesting. But they weren't just farmers, were they?
Not at all. Hunting was still crucial for survival. Deer, wild turkey, fish of all sorts, smaller game animals, they were all on the menu, and they were incredibly resourceful,
Oh, I bet.
using stone, bone, shell, whatever they could find to craft the tools they needed.
Talk about making do.
Exactly. From arrow points for hunting to pottery vessels for cooking and storing, grinding stones for processing food, even fish hooks, all made from the materials around them.
That's pretty incredible. And it wasn't just about practicality either. We see evidence of their creativity and artistic skills, especially in the pottery.
Absolutely. It starts to become more than just functional. You see decorative elements, specialized forms developing.
So it's like their artistic expression is starting to emerge through these everyday objects.
Exactly. That increase in complexity, that decoration, it suggests a developing artistic tradition and maybe even specialized roles within the community. Some people might have been particularly skilled at making pottery, right?
Makes sense. And how is society structured on a day-to-day basis?
Well, it seems likely that people lived in smaller family groups, scattered homesteads, or small hamlets, maybe coming together in larger villages every now and then for trade, ceremonies, communal work.
Right, like those barn raisings you see in old movies, but maybe for building a mound.
Exactly. Although the mounds we see here weren't on the same scale as the massive ones in some Mississippian centers.
Right. And this brings us to the burial practices.
Hmm.
The site table you mentioned earlier has a lot of detail about the Shepherd site, right in Ashley County and other nearby locations. What stands out to you about the discoveries there?
One thing that's really interesting and pretty consistent across these sites is the prevalence of what we call secondary interments.
Secondary interments meaning?
It means that there was an initial burial, but then the remains were moved or reburied later. Not uncommon in many cultures.
Okay, interesting.
We also see this general lack of fancy grave goods. Valuable objects buried with the deceased, which might indicate high status in other cultures. The remains themselves are often fragmented, and the number of individuals buried at any one site tends to be relatively small.
So it's a much different picture than what you might see at some of those big monumental burial mounds.
Exactly. Our sources actually contrast these findings with places like the funeral mound at Ocmulgee, a major Mississippian center in Georgia.
All right, tell us about that.
At Ocmulgee, you find evidence of log-lined tombs and some burials that include copper ornaments, elaborate shell carvings, the kind of things that scream high status. These findings really suggest a society with clear social hierarchy, where some individuals were afforded a much grander send-off in death. The simpler burials we see in southeastern Arkansas, well, they offer a very different perspective on how these societies viewed death, and maybe even how their communities were organized.
So how do we even begin to make sense of these less elaborate burial practices? What might they be telling us?
There are a few really compelling interpretations that come up in the regional context write-up. One is that they reflect community-centered customs. Maybe the focus was on the collective, the group, rather than elevating individuals in death.
Okay, I can see that.
And the practice of secondary burial, moving and reburying those bones, maybe that was part of a specific ritual, a way of integrating the deceased back into the community in a different form.
It's like a way of keeping them present even after death, in a sense.
Exactly. Another idea is that death was seen as a return to the earth, a simpler transition, without the need for all those material possessions.
So it's not about taking your riches with you to the afterlife.
Right. It might suggest a different kind of worldview where earthly possessions weren't considered that important in the afterlife, or maybe a cultural value placed on simplicity and equality in death. There's also the possibility of things like ritual defleshing, where soft tissues are removed from the bones before burial, or bundle burial, where the bones were collected and wrapped before final interment. These were practices seen in many Native American cultures. And lastly, it could also indicate a form of ancestor reverence that didn't necessarily involve these big, permanent monuments to individuals.
So instead of those grand displays, maybe it was about maintaining that connection to ancestors in a more integrated, less material way. More about the community, the collective memory.
Exactly. And what the sources suggest is that these practices might reflect smaller, more kin-based societies. Perhaps they predated the more hierarchical structures that developed in some of the larger Mississippian centers. Or maybe it was a conscious choice to maintain a different social order, a way of saying, we do things differently here.
It's like they were forging their own path, even within this broader Mississippian world. And that's where the comparison to the Macon Plateau culture really comes in handy, doesn't it? It helps us appreciate that diversity within the Mississippian world.
Absolutely. The Macon Plateau culture in central Georgia, which flourished around 900 to 1200 CE, gives us a very clear example of a more centralized Mississippian society. They were known for building these really impressive ceremonial complexes.
Those platform mounds we talked about earlier.
Exactly. At Ocmulgee, you see these huge, flat-topped earthen structures serving as foundations for important buildings, all made of wood.
Homes for leaders, temples, storage buildings.
All of the above. And remember the funeral mound at Ocmulgee. It contained over 100 burials. And while many of those were simple, some did include those elaborate grave goods we talked about. Copper ornaments, intricately carved shell pieces. Again, pointing to that social ranking, maybe even inherited status.
So a very different picture than what we see in southeastern Arkansas.
Precisely. And then you have the Earth Lodge at Ocmulgee, which is just incredible. Have you heard about that one?
Oh, yeah, with those molded seats built right into the walls. It's like a 1,000-year-old meeting hall.
Exactly. It has this bench with 47 molded seats and even a raised bird-shaped platform with additional seating.
It must have been a pretty important space.
Oh, definitely. Probably used for political discussions, ceremonies, maybe both. It gives you a real sense of a more formally organized community.
It does. And their daily life seems to have revolved around settled agriculture, too.
Yes, they were very skilled farmers, using tools made of wood, bone, and stone to cultivate their fields on a large scale. They grew a variety of crops, but corn and beans were their staples. The ability to produce and store surplus food probably played a big role in the development of their more complex social structure.
It maybe allowed for greater specialization of labor, too.
Absolutely. But just like the people in southeastern Arkansas, they also hunted to supplement their diet.
So everyone's got to eat, no matter how your society is organized.
Exactly. Small game, deer, they used everything they could. And we see evidence of their artistic talents, too, in their pottery, their personal adornment. Beautifully crafted pottery, shell gordits, beads, tattooing, paint.
And even their games weren't just about having fun, right?
Right. The game of chunky, a ball game similar to lacrosse. These were sometimes used to settle disputes between communities. It highlights a different level of social and political interaction compared to what we might be seeing in southeastern Arkansas, where things might have been organized differently.
So when we think about the people who lived in southeastern Arkansas during this late Woodland and Mississippian transition, who exactly were they? The sources mention that it's tough to definitively link them to specific modern-day tribes.
That's true. Based on the evidence we have, it's hard to say for sure these were the direct ancestors of this particular tribe. However, the regional context write-up does suggest potential links to a number of modern Native American groups, the Caddo, Quapaw, Tunica, and others with Mississippian heritage.
When we see these shared material culture traits with other traditions in the area too, Coles Creek, Plaquemine, Caddoan, It's all connected.
Absolutely. It really highlights the interconnectedness of these pre-contact cultures across the Southeast. There's a constant flow of ideas and influences.
So, southeastern Arkansas during this time, it seems like a truly unique and dynamic place. A region in transition, maybe charting its own course.
Exactly. By the time Europeans arrived centuries later, the people living in southeastern Arkansas had already been through hundreds of years of change and adaptation. The sources call it a dynamic frontier zone, which I think really captures it, a place where different cultural influences met and mingled in fascinating ways.
It's amazing to think that beneath the surface of what we see today in Ashley County and northeast Louisiana, there's this whole rich and complex history just waiting to be uncovered. And even though some of those burial sites might not have the flashy artifacts, the bones themselves, those settlement locations, the very landscape, they all hold clues about the lives, beliefs, and memories of those who came before us.
It really makes you think. So let's summarize what we've learned. The late Woodland and Mississippian periods in southeastern Arkansas were times of big cultural shifts.
With people deeply connected to their environment, to the rivers, the land.
Exactly. Their burial practices, they suggest this focus on community, maybe a different relationship with material wealth and death than what we see elsewhere.
But they were still part of these broader exchange networks connected to the wider world.
And they likely represent the ancestors of many Native American groups who have called this region home for centuries.
And the comparison to the Macon Plateau culture, it shows us that the Mississippian world wasn't a monolith. There was so much diversity in how people organized their societies, their beliefs, their practices.
What's particularly interesting to me is the contrast we see in southeastern Arkansas. We have this evidence of settled agriculture, suggesting a degree of permanence, but also those community-focused burial practices. It makes you wonder, what does this tell us about their social structures, their spiritual beliefs, their relationship with the land?
It's a question worth pondering. And so, to our listeners, especially those in Ashley County and Northeast Louisiana, we ask you, what do you think? What does this evidence of settled agriculture and those community-centered burial practices tell you about the people who lived there long ago? What other questions come to mind as you think about the pre-contact history of your own community? It's a history that's all around you, waiting to be explored.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.